Chapter 3. Something Simply Clicked. Judge Shake knew that he was old, retired, and not even a citizen of Chicago. But he also knew that a kind of drive and crusade was welling up inside of him that he had not felt for decades. Should he go to the local police and volunteer to help? That was likely out of the question. After all, what kind of help could a just-arrived 88-year-old man with a cane give to such a crack police department? And if he did offer his help, would they welcome it? Imagine a stranger walking into a Chicago police station. "I'd like to help. I've been a lawyer for more than 65 years. I've seen it all. I was at Nuremberg." How far would that get anybody? No, the answer likely was to work behind the scenes. The answer was to get out of the house and make his way to the records library of the city's largest newspaper, the Tribune. After all, he trusted it. He was a subscriber. He called it the Trib. The trip wouldn't be tough. He made some phone calls the next morning and found out he could take an Armitage Avenue bus. The bus stop was just half a block away. That would take him to a Chicago metro station where he could catch a train headed downtown toward Tribune Tower. The young lady who answered the local bus system's helpline was just that, very helpful. Shake explained that he was new to the city, didn't have a car, and would be riding the bus a lot. The woman gave him the routing info he needed, then took his name and address and promised to send a citywide map. "It's quite a thick booklet," she warned him. "That's okay. I know how to file and handle books. Just send it. And my coat has big pockets." After the call, looking at his notes, he realized he might be on one of Chicago's mass transit system's buses or trolleys for many hours in the coming days. He quickly needed to find that huge jar of quarters he had packed and had shipped. "There are enough quarters there to get me from here to Chicago's downtown to Kansas City," he thought. It would be 2 weeks before he would find the jar, even though he thought all of his boxes had been well marked. But in the meanwhile, he found enough small change to get him in and out of the Chicago transit system several times. After a trip that was longer and more circuitous than he had hoped for, Shake arrived at Tribune Tower, home of the Chicago Tribune newspaper. He got some good news from the receptionist at the big desk in the lobby. Yes, the paper did have an archivist. She was a historian who took care of all of the paper's records and had every past issue. Over the years, as an ardent fan of radio and TV detective shows, he had learned that all major American newspapers had a library they called the morgue. He was told that the Tribune's morgue contained every back issue of the paper, every editorial, every photograph, well, at least back as far as anyone could remember. Hopefully the morgue contained all the incoming information the paper had so far on the case of the brutally murdered couple profiled on the nightly news. The lady who ran the morgue was herself nearing retirement. Judge Shake addressed her by the first name on her badge in a most fatherly manner. He explained his desire to do some research on a major news event. First, though, he asked the woman to look up all of the newspaper's coverage of the I.G. Farben trial at Nuremberg in 1947. It took some sorting, using a huge system of microfilm back issues, but the 1947 newspaper coverage of what happened in Nuremberg was extensive. There were inches of columns of news reports, lots of photographs. Shake pointed to one of the photos. It showed the members of the tribunal in the Farben case. "That's me," he said with a smile as he pointed to the man at the center of the bench. Of course, I was younger back then. The woman didn't say anything. She just thought for a couple of seconds. Then after those few seconds of silence, she laughed and said, "You have the best photo ID of anyone who's ever come down here. Now let's get to work. What's up?" Over the next few weeks, Judge Shake and Dolores Monahan would become good friends. It would not be long before he would be inviting her to that Irish pub across the street from his apartment for an occasional nightcap. Ironically, Monahan lived less than 2 miles from the judge. She lived across the street from a big dental office in a 6th-floor apartment house at Armitage and Racine. She need only take the Armitage bus over to Judge Shake's neighborhood. When Shake first went to the Tribune, the case was still new and just hours old. There were few facts, but the newspaper printed everything it had. The Tribune had assigned a reporter who would work closely with the police during the investigation. "You need to talk to Brad Gibson," Monahan told him. "He's our guy covering the story firsthand. I've learned that he called one of the editors that night to demand that he be put on the case. I wouldn't really call him a crusading reporter, but he certainly has taken up some kind of cause in dealing with this. If you don't mind, I'll call his phone and invite him to come down. I want him to meet you anyway. Maybe you can figure out why he was so hell-bent and determined to be the reporter covering the case for the paper." Less than 5 minutes later, a brash-appearing young man who looked more like a young college professor than a newspaper reporter arrived at the morgue in the basement of Tribune Tower. "I'm Brad Gibson. You must be that Nuremberg guy Dolores told me about on the phone." "Well, I'm not sure that's the best handle for me," Shake replied, "but I'll take it. I was a prosecutor at Nuremberg." Mrs. Monahan interrupted, and Brad, when he saw Channel 9's coverage of that killing in the suburbs of that Schneider couple, he told me he blew a fuse. Now he's here to start his own special investigation, quietly. He's had enough experience with all kinds of newspapers to know that we are the best place to start without disturbing the police or preventing them from doing their job in the case. I'm glad he's here." Brad spoke. "So, sir, what makes you think you can do anything to help? After all, there are few, if any, clues. Everything's been dusted for fingerprints. Nothing. I haven't had any news from City Hall since late last night, and I don't really expect much. Do you intend to stick with the story, Brad?" "Well, as long as there's a story to follow, sir." "Call me Kurt," Shake said. "If you don't mind my tagging along, and I can still move pretty quickly at 88 despite the cane, but I don't want you calling me sir all the time. Someone might think you're on a class assignment and I'm an aging journalism professor. I wouldn't like that. And, Mrs. Monahan, I'd prefer if you called me Kurt also. And remember, the moment I get in the way or ask too many questions or get close to getting either of you in trouble, be honest with me. I know how to handle disappointment. Now, is there a place nearby where I can take you both to lunch? It's my treat." "Well, Kurt," Gibson replied, "if you can stand the name, there's the Billy Goat Tavern. It's not great, but it's cheap." The lunch was full of questions, and the Billy Goat Tavern was no Marone's, and it wasn't Wednesday, and worse still, it didn't serve Canada Dry. Most of the questions came from the young reporter Brad Gibson, who was fascinated with the judge's time in Nuremberg. "Was it really as horrible as I can imagine?" "Worse," answered Shake. What we heard in the testimony and saw on the films that were presented was tough to stomach, and I mean that literally. And during all of the trial, we had to wear those wretched and really heavy headphones. None of this light stuff you kids have today. There were simultaneous translations going on, just like at the UN. You turned a little dial to tune into whatever language you wanted. If I remember, we had 5 choices. The engineers had set up colored light bulbs in front of us. They told us when our microphones were on, the translations were taking place, and a light bulb came on. It was a slow learning curve, but we learned. Finally, we forgot we were wearing those bulky headphones. I can tell you I learned a lot, and not just about light bulbs and headphones. I soon learned about the kind of insane inhumanity some people can display in regard to their fellow men and women and children. I learned about a kind of thinking that seeks to place a race of people on a pinnacle, not because of their own efforts, but by vicious, brutal destruction of the lives of those under them. I learned how one man can rise to the top, and if he has hypnotic powers, seduce an entire nation into thinking his rotten, evil, twisted thoughts, and finally put all those thoughts into brutal action, while at the same time destroying the nation he said he was building to last 1,000 years. Oh, I learned a lot, and you know what? I would do it all again, even tomorrow, if I had a chance. But 1947 was a long time ago. A very long time, Brad, and likely you weren't even born yet. No, but I'm not new to the topic. The first day I worked at the Trib, Gibson said, I was sent out to cover an incident at a synagogue. A bus filled with kids from the Jewish grade school was just returning from a day in the country. As the bus neared the synagogue, a bunch of teens riding in a speeding hot rod swerved toward the bus, trying to run it off the street. They shouted obscenities and anti-Jewish remarks and threatened the bus. The driver lost control and slammed into a tree. A little girl was thrown through the windshield. She died instantly. When I got there, one of her uncles was kicking the tree, scratching at it. His hands were bleeding. He was screaming in a language I had never heard before. I found out later he was one of the rabbis there. He was screaming something from the Old Testament. His shouts were in Hebrew. I asked someone in the crowd if they could translate what he was screaming. I was told his words were a reaction in the book of Job, the 10th chapter, the 22nd verse. What the uncle was wailing was something I'll never forget. I curse the day I was born. Life is the light. Death is the darkness. Why wasn't I taken into the darkness at birth? In other words, the rabbi hated the fact that he had lived to see such an awful thing. He was screaming to his God just as Job had done thousands of years before. That moment, that first assignment really moved me. Ever since, there has not been a month go by that I have not thought of the screams I heard from that grief-ravaged rabbi, and on the first day of my job, I can still see his bleeding hands and his tortured face. It was quite a first assignment. In the ensuing years, I read everything I could about anti-Semitism, about the story of the Holocaust and other things. I've watched a lot of documentaries. I've even sorted through the morgue looking for more. Kurt, be honest with me. Is it strange for me to want to see all that horrible stuff? Is that normal? You were there. Judge Shake thought and then said, well, Brad, as long as you can use what you learn to put yourself on the right path, to use that understanding to become a better you, it's fine. Did any of that learning come back to you when you reported on the killing of the Snyders? I understand from Dolores you fought to have that assignment. Yes, sir. I mean, Kurt, when I saw that swastika painted on the couple's house and then heard what the officers said about what they had seen inside, I couldn't get it out of my mind. We've had a lot of anti-Jewish crimes here in Chicago before, but last night, well, maybe the same thing happened to me that happened to you. It was as if a pressure valve went off in my brain. Enough of this! Enough of this! May I ask you something personal, Kurt? Ask away, the judge replied. Nuremberg. I want to know more about that trial. I want to know everything. Well, Brad and Dolores, I was not the main presiding judge at the big trial, the one that made all the headlines, the one portrayed in that awesome movie Judgment at Nuremberg. Don't worry, I wasn't Spencer Tracy. I was the chief prosecutor at a very, very important second trial. It was officially called the United States of America versus Carl Crouch. It became known as the Farben trial. You see, Farben, actually the IG Farben Company, was a private German chemical company, kind of like DuPont here. Farben had worked closely with the Nazi regime in the production of killer gases that were used in the extermination camps. Farben supplied much of the material to be used for what they were calling the final solution. You see, the phrase "the final solution" was a code among the leadership of the Nazis for the intimidation and persecution and brutal elimination of all Jews in all the parts of the world the Nazis controlled. It's ironic that it all began in 1933. What's so important about that year? Brad asked the judge. Well, you see, both Hitler and FDR came to power that year. I was in my mid-40s at the time. I watched as FDR pulled the nation out of a near-fatal nosedive in the Great Depression, while Hitler led his people out of the same depression. But FDR did it through job creation and public works and dams and schools and airports and radio chats that made us all feel he was our friend. Hitler did it through the rebuilding of tanks and guns and the acquisition of poison gas from the Farben Company that I was sent to Germany a decade later and a half to bring to trial. Hitler gave every home a radio, then used the German airwaves for his tyrannical, rabble-rousing, often shouted speeches. But back to the Farben Company. In all truth, the Farben gases killed millions of people, and the company knew it from the start. That's what we had to prove. The defendants in the trial were the former board of directors. They were smug. We found out the company had a long-time reputation of working with the government as far back as World War I. At that time, when supplies of fertilizer were cut off to Germany, Farben jumped into work on synthetic chemicals, nitrates, to produce better fertilizer. And kids, while Farben's engineers were at it, they discovered better ways to make dynamite and other war munitions and killer gas. So we knew early from research and common knowledge that this was one company that was in cahoots with the military and didn't care who knew it. But the first big issue for me was the way Farben produced its products. Slave labor. They used the people from the concentration camps to do the filthy work to produce the gases that would kill their relatives. It was a vicious circle of cruelty, hardship, and documented death. I presume all the directors were sent to death? Dolores asked. Well, I would have had to have thrown the book at them, but for a variety of reasons, the prosecutions weren't that simple. More than half the defendants were found guilty on at least one charge. The others were acquitted. There was just too much pressure on us to do it right. Mine was one of several trials at Nuremberg, not the big one, where Hess, Goering, Speer, Dönitz, Bormann, and the others were on trial. It seemed the urgency had gone. The public had lost interest. There was still international media attention to get it all over. I can safely say by the time the first trial was over, the world was sick of Nuremberg. I think if we'd had the time, the other filthy men on trial would have been convicted, but it didn't turn out that way. I took a lot of flack for that. People thought the punishments were too lenient. But I still had to watch the smug faces of the death merchants as they sat in the box day after day while the evidence piled up around them. I got to the point I began to dread the day when I would have to look them in the eye and sentence them. But it was during the trial I had a near year to put together everything and put it in perspective. I looked at the film shown at the big trial. I saw the stomach-turning movies shown of stacks of dead bodies piled up like so much cordwood, the discards of heinous genocide. I knew, as the great radio reporter Edward R. Murrow had relayed back to the States via shortwave, that murder had been committed at Buchenwald. I walked the cobblestone streets of Nuremberg at night to try to clear my head. The city was still in ruins. So were the lives of its people. The very same people we had rained bombs down on because their leader drove them into a kind of brutal and horrible self-administered suicide. I read the transcripts of the trial. In a way, I lived both trials. I don't want to go back, but with what happened the other night in the suburbs, I am back again, whether I like it or not. For a very long time, no one said anything. Then Brad broke the silence. "It's really ironic you are here, Judge Kurt. As if you were meant to be. You're a tangible link back to those days and those memories, and you represent what is good and right. If there is any good and right connected with this, I would love to have you help me in any way in the coming days. I feel lucky that the editor put me on the case. He'd gotten an earlier phone call from Neil Pratt, a young writer who's from that new generation that has no fear. Someone even nicknamed him the Tiger. But I got the assignment. I feel fortunate, and I want you to help me." "I'm no detective, you know," Judge Shake responded. "Yes, but you know the law. You know the truth. You can see through the hype and the crap and the name-calling and the issues and see the bigger picture," Brad said. "Considering your background and the fact that this was obviously an anti-Jewish hate crime, it goes without saying that it is an honor to have you here. I think you can teach us all a lot. All those years I spent doing research on Hitler and the Jews and on Nuremberg, I never thought I would know someone who could connect me to all of that." Judge Shake suddenly had a warm feeling inside of him that he was among friends, that he'd found a new home and a new cause, and a noble one. Find the killers of Mr. and Mrs. Snyder. It was the least he could do for an elderly couple he had never known or met. But in many ways, Judge Curtis Shake knew them. He had seen their faces before. He had already known of their suffering, but he had nearly forgotten. He'd liked the fact the dark memories were fading, but he found out that all of those memories came back last night when he turned on the Channel 9 nightly news. Join me again for the next part of Return to Nuremberg.